Welcome everybody. I'd love to introduce Martin van Ittersum from University of Wageningen, who's been focusing on supply of food security and supply chains in Africa. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg. And I presume it's mostly morning for you, but I'm not sure. For me, it's actually the evening just started. Yeah. So good day, everybody. It's my pleasure to present a study which we published recently, and it's entitled Prospects for Cereal Self-Sufficiency in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors from my own team, but also from many African institutions and international institutions. So let me see if I can get this going. Yes. Probably some of you, perhaps many, I don't know exactly your background, are familiar with some global outlooks on the increase in demand for food until 2050. There is some consensus that this ranges between 35 and 50%. If you express the demand for food in 2050 versus 2010, so 35 to 50%. I mean, it depends on many factors, but these are global numbers. And my point would be that this global number is actually not so very meaningful, because the increases in demand are very, very region specific. They are a function of population increase, I should say, and of dietary change. And here I show the population in time, and you immediately see, well, first of all, how skewed the population distribution is across the globe, with Asia in, let's say, the yellow color, and Africa in blue, so dominant in terms of global population. And more importantly, for this talk, is that the increase in the population is particularly strong in Asia again, but towards in the course of this century, particularly in Africa. That's where the extra people will be born and will live. So the increase in population is very steep in Africa. If we then look at the per capita consumption, then this relationship is very important. On the y-axis, you see the per capita caloric demand. So the number of calories taken in per capita per day. And on the x-axis, the per capita GDP, the gross domestic product, so what people earn in terms of money. And you see a quite good relationship between income and between the caloric intake. And if I also explain that the different colors of the symbols refer to different groups of countries with from low to high income, so on the left with the purple color here, and the yellow and green colors, these are low-income countries, whereas the red ones, that's the group of countries which includes the USA, United States of America, but also the Netherlands and other countries in Northwestern Europe. So you see, if countries become richer, more affluent, the caloric intake increases along this in this figure. And you also see the patterns that have taken place in time. So in the course of 40-50 years, you see how the demand has increased in the richer countries, but you also see that in the poorer countries. Now, some of you may wonder, okay, do I consume 9,000 kilocalories, up to 9,000 kilocalories a day? No, hopefully not, because it will be very unhealthy. But what I express here, or what David Tillman, from who I borrowed this slide, expresses here, is the total number of calories involved in producing your, let's say, your diet. So that includes the calories that you need for your cheese, for your butter, for your piece of meat, etc., which is many more than what you consume in the livestock products. So that's the consumption side, which increases or which changes in time, very region specific. But the same story could be told about production. Here I show how production has changed over, let's say, my lifetime, the past 60 years. On the left, the maize yields for different parts of the world. In gray, North America, so the maize, how maize yields have increased over the past 60 years in North America from about 4 tons per hectare per year to say 10 or 11 per hectare. So almost a tripling of the yields. And if you contrast that with the very slow yield increase in the red symbols, which is Africa, you see an increase from say 1 ton per hectare up to around 2 tons now. So in the course of 60 years, it has doubled, but from a very low 1 ton to about 2 tons per hectare. Very interesting graph is the one on the right, where I express the changes that have occurred since 1961, so 60 years, more than 60 years ago, in terms of the area that we use for our cereal production. So 100% is the area that was in use in 1961. And then the changes in time, so in the next 60 years, have been expressed compared to that 100% in 1961. And the same we did for the yields on the y-axis. And then you nicely see how very different developments have been in different parts of the world. In green and in gray, the symbols, Europe and North America, the same colors as I used in the left graph. And what you see here is that actually the area compared to 1961 has decreased. It's less than 100% now, and substantially less actually. It's 10, 20, 30% less than in 1961. Particularly, well, it's clear for both parts of the world, Europe and North America. At the same time, we see an enormous increase in yield. So the kilograms per hectare that have been harvested for each hectare of cereal, wheat, rice, maize, you name it. You see that in time, this has increased 2.5 up to 3.5 times. So 250% of what it was in 1961 in Europe, and more than 300% of what it was in 1961 for North America. So these two parts of the world have seen a shrinking crop area, but an enormous increase in yields. Now, if you contrast that with Africa, you see quite the opposite. A very drastic increase in the area. So the area that we have used to grow cereals, more than a doubling. And the yields have increased very slowly, as we saw already in the left graph for maize. So Africa is basically the only continent on our planet that has, let's say, kept up with the demand in food, mostly through area expansion and not through yield increases. So they have been using more and more land to produce their food, and while the yields have increased only very slowly, and that contrasts very much with other parts of the world. Now, taking these things together, I've made my point that this global estimate of the increase in food demand is not so meaningful. This 35 to 50%, I don't bother too much, to be honest. There are two extremes. Sub-Saharan Africa will have the fastest demand increase in the next 30 years or so, because of population increase, which will be the steepest in that continent, and because the current caloric intake is very low because of low incomes, but it's expected that that will increase because of income increases. So Sub-Saharan Africa should have a production and availability focus when it comes to food. The other extreme could be Europe, to a lesser extent maybe also the North of America, where the demand will stabilize because our populations are aging, are stabilizing, maybe even shrinking a bit. And also for human health reasons, it would be better if we consumed less animal-based proteins, so the demand will stabilize or decrease, and we can focus on environment, on health, on healthy nutrition, because production doesn't have to increase. So for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on Sub-Saharan Africa, the subcontinent where the demand will increase by far the most if you compare it across the entire world. So what we did a study for 10 countries, which are quite representative for a large part of Sub-Saharan Africa, 5 in Western Africa, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Mali, Niger, and Nigeria, and then 5 in Eastern and Southern Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. Together, these 10 countries make up more than 50% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa, and even more of the arable lands. So if you look at that, these two numbers, then actually the 10 countries are relatively affluent in arable land. They have a little bit more land than the other parts of sub-Saharan Africa per person. So it's actually, the picture I will show is rather favorable if you want, compared to the rest. We focused on the 5 dominant cereals: maize, wheat, rice, sorghum, and millet. Who together they make up roughly half of the crop area in this part of the world, and are responsible for close to 50, a bit less than 50% of the caloric and protein intake of human beings in sub-Saharan Africa. And for the rest of the talk, I will express everything in maize equivalent. So I aggregated maize yields, wheat yields, rice yields, sorghum yields, and millet yields in maize equivalents for to make it more easy to compare different parts of Africa with different compositions of these 5 crops. So, as I showed you, the production has increased in Africa mostly through area expansion, and that is something we must stop for various reasons. One, of course, is that at some states there is no land left, no suitable land left for agriculture. But secondly, for reasons of biodiversity conservation and for reasons of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Every extra hectare of land used for agriculture means loss of biodiversity and means emission of more greenhouse gases because of the carbon stocks which are decomposed. So we looked in the study at what are the possibilities to increase yields on existing agricultural land. So on the area which is already in use for agriculture, for cropping, how much can yields increase? And for that, some concepts are important. In the green bar, I've indicated the yield potential. So this is what yields potentially could be on let's say, a piece of land in a certain climate, if the farmer did everything perfect. So he or she managed the crop perfect. There's no water stress, no nutrient stress, no weeds, no pests and diseases that consume the crop, etc. Then you can achieve the yield potential, the highest yield possible. I must say that the green bar in our calculations, we always distinguish 2 situations. One, a situation where irrigation is possible, so there is water available to irrigate the crop. But in many parts of the world, this is not possible because there is not enough irrigation water, no surface water or no groundwater to irrigate. And in that case, we define the yield potential for rain-fed conditions. So depending on the rainfall, what would be the highest yield a farmer could achieve? And in the rest of my talk for Africa, it's mostly rain-fed yield potential because irrigation possibilities are severely limited in Africa, certainly if you compare it with Asia and parts of the United States. In red, the red bar is let's say, the average farm yield. So the average yields that you will find on the farms in a certain region characterized by climate and soils. So that actual yield, of course, is affected by imperfect management of the farms. The difference between the two, the green and the red one, is what we call the yield gap, and increasing farmers' yields by narrowing the yield gap is what we call the yield gap closure. So this is yield gap closure is the way to increase production without expanding agricultural land. And that's the focus of our studies, to see what yield gap closure can bring in terms of extra production and whether the production potential is enough to actually keep up with the increasing demand because of population change and because of dietary change in sub-Saharan Africa.
So
now we did that. Yes.
You're pointing that the reason for the decreased need for calories is economic development. So to what extent will money kind of flow for free because the demand is driven by having more money?
The demand is driven by population increase, so extra people, and it's driven by higher incomes. And so your question, Craig, is then?
Oh, to what extent will those people pay for more intensive practices and so on? So to what extent do you have a driver just by the fact that more money will come from people who can afford better food, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so people will, of course, have to pay for the extra food, and they can also afford a more, let's say, luxurious diet because they have more money to spend on food. Is that your question, or?
Yes. Well, you mentioned that irrigation is difficult. Well, to some extent, it's a money thing. So to what extent is it a natural constraint as the constraint versus paying for infrastructure as a constraint?
Right, yeah. So it's mostly the availability of water. Secondly, certainly also the infrastructure to irrigate the crops. That's also true, but natural conditions are such that the amount of water is severely constrained for irrigation.
Okay, thank you.
So what I first do in this slide is to look back at a study we did about 10 years ago. So we estimated the cereal self-sufficiency possibilities for the 10 countries that I mentioned by 2050. And we published that in a paper in PNAS, and the title was "Can Sub-Saharan Africa Feed Itself?" And the conclusions of that study were basically these. So we estimated at that time that the demand would almost triple between 2050 and 2010. Can you imagine? In 40 years, a tripling of the demand for cereals because of extra people, dietary change. We used the yield gap and the yield gap closure idea, which we assessed in our global yield gap atlas, a project that has been going on with University of Nebraska and a Wageningen collaboration for the past 15 years. And here you see the colors in Sub-Saharan Africa, the relative yield gap closure. So what farmers achieve in yield, the actual yield, YA, actual yield of farmers, as a percentage of the rain-fed potential yield, YW. And what you see here is that most farmers in most regions in Sub-Saharan Africa, the maize yield, this is referring to the maize yield, is around 20, maybe 30% of what is theoretically possible under rain-fed conditions. So no irrigation, without irrigation, even in those conditions, farmers achieve only 20, 30% of what is theoretically possible if they did everything perfect. Now we took those calculations and estimated to what extent West Africa and East Africa could keep up with the increasing demand. And here I show 4 scenarios for West and East Africa. And here is the self-sufficiency. So a self-sufficiency ratio of 1 means that the part of Africa produces exactly enough to meet the demand for its local people. So a ratio of 1 means that that West Africa produces exactly enough to feed its own people with the cereals that they produce. So the darkest color, the green color at the bottom, that would be the self-sufficiency ratio if yields did not change between 2010 and 2050. So it would be a self-sufficiency of around 30%. That's, I mean, of course, a very pessimistic scenario. So yield stabilization, something not likely to happen, but just as a reference. Then if we would continue with the yield increases that we have observed over the past, until 2010, 20, 30 years, then the self-sufficiency by 2050, if we would extrapolate that to 2050, would be around 40%, a bit lower in West Africa, a bit higher in East Africa. So only these parts of Sub-Saharan Africa would be only able to feed 40% of their own population. The other 60% would have to come from imports and exports if we follow the current trends. Only if they manage to narrow the gap to about 80% of the potential, water-limited yield potential, which is something that we have achieved in Northwest Europe and in parts of the United States, only then we could get close to self-sufficiency. So, in other words, in just 40 years, the farmers would have to move from the red and the orange colors in this map with, say, roughly 20% yield gap closure to the green colors which means 80% yield cap closure. This is something that has never ever happened before in any part of the world in history. So our conclusion in 2016 in that paper was, well, yes, theoretically it's possible that on existing cropland, sub-Saharan Africa could feed itself, but it's, I mean, between the lines you could read it would be a tremendous challenge to achieve this. Now, we did this study recently, and that was published again in PNAS and with the title Prospects for Cereal Self-Sufficiency in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we first looked at what has happened between 2010 and 2020, so recently, in 10 years' time. In that period, the population did increase by 29%, almost 30% more people in just 10 years' time. Enormous numbers. So this figure shows the self-sufficiency again of the 5 cereals as it was in 2010, so the starting situation, and then in 2020 in the somewhat darker green color. And what you see is a slight increase for West Africa and East and Southern Africa. On average, let's say from 80 to around 90% self-sufficiency for the 5 cereals. And here you see the results for the individual countries. Now that's remarkable. With 29% extra people in 10 years, the self-sufficiency did increase, let's say around 10%. Why could that happen? Well, we found 3 reasons. First of all, the area continued to increase. That was the dominant, actually one of the important main reasons. So extra land was added to the existing cropland. So the trend which I showed you before continued in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this happened more in West Africa than in East and Southern Africa, I should say. There was also an important change in cropping patterns. So more farmers started to grow maize rather than millet. And maize gives much higher yields, on at least in quite okay situations, if it's not too dry and not too hot. So a substitution of the millet crop by the maize crop. And thirdly, the yields did increase, at least in some countries, particularly in East and Southern Africa. But I will show you the variation. So these are the 3 reasons why the self-sufficiency improved in 10 years, despite a 29% increase in population. Here is the example of changes in cropping. In 2010, the percentage that these different cereals took of the total cereal area, so each column adds up to 100%, rain-fed maize, rain-fed millet, rain-fed rice, irrigated rice, rain-fed sorghum, rain-fed wheat. And you see that from 2010 to 2020, the percentage taken by maize has increased quite a lot, while the percentage taken by millet has decreased a lot. A little bit the same has happened, but much less in East and Southern Africa. So a substitution of millets and more maize. Here's a graph showing what has happened in terms of yields. This is showing the average for entire Sub-Saharan Africa, the green color. So around 30 kilograms per hectare per year, every year, the yields increase on average. There's quite a bit of fluctuation. And you see in red, for the eastern part of Sub-Saharan Africa, that was a bit higher. And for purple, west, it was a bit less than the average. So here I illustrate how in East and Southern Africa, the yields have increased on average quite a bit. And that also contributed to this more positive self-sufficiency in 2020 compared to 2010. But here you see the variation between countries. A very positive example is Ethiopia. A negative example is Tanzania. And Nigeria and Mali take an intermediate position. But actually, apart from Ethiopia, very sobering increases in yields per hectare. Now let's then look ahead. at what will happen with population. So I already told you that the population increased between 2020 and 2010 by 29%. If we then look ahead to 2050, then the, let's say, medium projection is that there will be 75% more people than in 2020. Over 1 billion in these 10 countries, whereas it is slightly above 500 million in 2020. Look at Nigeria, 372 million people. It will be the 3rd country in terms of population on our planet by 2050. Yet the outlook is a little bit less pessimistic, or a little bit less dramatic than it was 10 years or 15 years ago. So the projections are downsized a little bit. So the 1 billion would have been higher, close to 1.2 billion in 2016, when I looked at the data of the United Nations. If we add the population increase and the dietary change, which is expected because of higher incomes of the people, then overall for the 10 countries that we estimated, we expect roughly a doubling of the demand, close to a factor 2. Largely because of population increase, but also a bit because of dietary change, some 10% higher caloric intake per person per day. So that gives us here in this figure, in the lighter color, the demand for 2020, and roughly twice as high in the darker color. So that's the additional demand because of more people and changes in diet. So we took these demand changes again to estimate to what extent sub-Saharan Africa can feed itself in terms of cereals on the current area. And we took here 2 scenarios. In the light green color, again, with no change in yields, 2020 yields we took, and we projected these also for 2050, a very pessimistic scenario. And this diagram shows that then by 2050, the self-sufficiency would be less than 50%. For sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, a little bit less than 50%. If, on the other hand, the yields would increase to half of the potential, mostly rain-fed potential, YW, in sub-Saharan Africa, then they would achieve self-sufficiency on current cereal areas. That is a much more optimistic outlook, or less pessimistic if you wish, than the one in 2016, where I showed that even 80% yield gap closure was just not enough to reach 100% self-sufficiency. Now it looks like 50% is already enough to reach self-sufficiency. Of course, there is a lot of variation across the 10 countries, but through trade and certainly within regions, this could be evened out, and I think this is the most important to look at. We also looked at the scenario of trend changes. So that's the darker green color, and you see if the yields continue to change as historically was the case, as let's say the past 20 years, then this is not enough to reach self-sufficiency by 2050. The yields need to increase much faster than that to achieve 100% self-sufficiency.
So question, in your analysis, are you assuming, this is for rain-fed?
Yes.
But the climate change is going to change the patterns of rain. To what extent is that a factor?
Yeah, very good question. So I was about to tell that in this graph actually, but good that you pointed it. So here, how achievable are these yield levels? So that's basically the question. Also with climate change. Here are 3 yield levels. So current yields, if the yields would continue to change until 2050 as they did historically, and in the darkest green color, 50 or roughly the yield levels needed to achieve self-sufficiency. YSS, Y self-sufficiency. And how realistic are these yield levels? Well, the horizontal lines here are the yield potentials under rain-fed conditions, mostly. Only rice basically is irrigated, but that's a small crop in Africa. These are the yield potentials, considering also climate change. So we took into account temperature changes, precipitation changes, the best we can forecast at this moment, and the CO2 increases, which is normally a positive thing for crops, because CO2 is actually a substance which is used in the photosynthesis. So to cut a long story short, also with climate change, these yields seem to be feasible, but require a drastic change compared to the current trends. If I have to summarize the whole story, this would be my message. So historically, the yields have been increasing very slowly, 20 kilograms per hectare per year if you average it for all the cereals together. If that trend continues until 2050, we would only achieve 30% roughly of the yield potential, and it would by far not be enough to reach self-sufficiency. In other words, Africa would become hugely import dependent. If, on the other hand, we manage to achieve a yield trend change, so almost 3 times as much, so let's say 60 kilograms per hectare per year, we would achieve half of the yield potential, and the self-sufficiency could be reached on current cropland for the extra people and the extra demand that we anticipate by 2050. Now, if we do not manage to realize that yield trend change, the tripling of the yields basically, then either sub-Saharan Africa becomes hugely import dependent, and of course you need a lot of finances to make that import possible, and you make Africa hugely dependent on geopolitical volatility of availability and of prices, etc. So that is not very desirable for a basic need of the people. And secondly, the option would be further area expansion, but I already explained that this is not very desirable because of greenhouse gas emissions and because of biodiversity loss. So I think it's very much needed to increase the yields. But then, of course, the question is, okay, how do we achieve it? What is needed for this? Well, one important thing is more crop nutrients, fertilizers, nitrogen, for instance, phosphorus, potassium. So we estimated how much more nutrients are needed to increase the yields, to change this yield trends from 20 to 60 kilograms per hectare per year. And is that really climate smart from a greenhouse gas emission point of view? So a few more slides, and then I will wind up. Here in this graph, again, for the West Africa, East and Southern Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and then the 10 countries, the amount of nitrogen that farmers are applying on average to their cereal crops per hectare per year. And it's very low. If you compare that to the United States and Europe, it's between 20 and 30 kilograms per hectare per year, very low. If you compare that to what is taken away by the harvest of every crop every year, so through maize, through rice, through wheat, etc., that is even more than has been added through fertilizers. So what it means is actually that you're mining the soils. There is a negative balance of nitrogen. There's more taken away than is added through fertilizers. And that, of course, is a very unsustainable situation. So we calculated if you would balance, say, the offtake, so what is taken up by the crop through fertilizers, how much you will need to add. And this is then the result of this. So in the horizontal bar lines, again, what is currently applied in 2020. And then in the different green colors, how much the crop would need to produce the yields of 2020, the extrapolation of the trend until 2050, and this in the darkest color, what you would need to be self-sufficient by 2050. So roughly 3 times as much as is used today. So 3 times more nitrogen fertilizer is needed than currently used. We did the same calculations for other important nutrients, phosphorus, P, and potassium, K. And the situation is even more dramatic. As you can see, there's a larger difference between what is applied now, the horizontal lines, 2020, and the dark green color, the bar, what is needed in 2050 to become self-sufficient. So much more than a factor 3 even. So fertilizer in use, proper fertilizer use, is a key step in the intensification and higher making cereal production much more productive than today. Is that climate smart? And that's my final result. And this is not completely updated. So this is, say, about 5 years back with the results that we had from the previous study, but I think the trends will still hold. It shows you the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions involved in 4 different scenarios. This is a very hypothetical and in practice impossible scenario, but it's good to as a reference. So if the yields would not change until 2050, and Africa would feed itself by expanding the area, so an enormous expansion of the area, and in that way keeping up with the increase in the demand, this would be the total greenhouse gas emissions because of area expansion and deforestation and savannas being taken away, and soil organic carbon being decomposed, etc. And then if you go to the right, the scenarios intensify up to the scenario where yields become 80% of the potential. So then most of the emission, then there will be hardly no emissions from expansion. So the area will be frozen, you could say. So no deforestation or savannas being taken away at the for cropland, and most of the emissions will be because of fertilizer use and because of rice production and some other sources, but it's mostly fertilizer use. And if you do that well, if you fertilize efficiently and agronomically with good agronomic management, then you see that the greenhouse gas emissions will be lowest in that intensive scenario, much lower than if you compare it with the scenarios where you expand the area. But if you do it with current agronomy of the farmers, so with the current management, the differences become very subtle. So if you apply the fertilizer use not in an efficient manner, and you do not combine it with good cultivars, with good weed management, with good pest and disease management, then the greenhouse gas emissions between the different scenarios will be rather similar. There's not a huge difference. So good agronomy is essential to become climate smart. So let me wrap up. Key messages. So first of all, area expansion in Africa continue to be an important contributor to production increase also between 2010 and 2020. But production also increased thanks to a shift from millet to maize, and particularly in areas which are not too warm and not too dry, there it added to the production. I also showed that until 2050, the demand for cereals will double again. So 1.98, I showed you 1.97. So a doubling of the demand for cereals. And given the larger baseline area, and because the area has increased, and because there is more maize now, and because population increase is a bit less steep than we thought 10, 15 years ago, now some 50% of the yield potential will be enough to achieve self-sufficiency in 2050. That's a much more optimistic outlook and prospect for the subcontinent. But it still requires a tripling of the yield trend. So the current trends are by far not enough. And it requires more than a tripling of the fertilizer inputs of nitrogen, of phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients, assuming good agronomy. So this is really a minimum estimate. It could well be more if the agronomy is not so good. And finally, I should say that the outlook is that population growth will not stop by 2050. it's anticipated that between 2050 and 2100, population will grow another 60%. So there's no time to lose for this subcontinent, and the world, together with African institutions and African people, should invest in a more productive agriculture. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I acknowledge again my co-authors, including the experts from Sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, thank you very much. So let me see, I have a number of questions. First of all, just to understand the impact of fertilizer. So I think I misunderstood your slide, because I thought on the left side, the optimal fertilizer use, you were saying constant emissions, but then you also pointed out, or the next slide.
Yep.
Constant emissions, essentially, but you're saying you need 3 times more fertilizer. So what is that? Can you like rationalize that?
Yeah, so you mean the gray bar is almost similar in the 4 scenarios.
Exactly, like the emissions are roughly the same, but the amount is different. So what's happening?
Well spotted. So the area here is much larger than the area here. So although per hectare you would use much less fertilizer, because you have so many extra hectares, the total amount of fertilizer would be quite similar compared to the small area where you need per hectare much more fertilizer. So let's say here you use per hectare maybe only 20 kilograms, but you have 3 times as many hectares. And here you apply probably 60 kilograms, but you have 3 times less hectares.
I see. That's what manages it. Okay, now if you were to start replacing conventional fertilizer with bacterial fertilizer and these alternatives which are lower greenhouse gases, how will that story change?
Yeah, I think my point would be we have to use organic sources of fertilizers like livestock manure or compost, or even human waste if it can be recycled in a responsible manner. We have to use these sources first and then complement it with mineral fertilizers. My point would be there is simply not enough organic fertilizers in Africa to satisfy the demand of the crop. So you will need also mineral fertilizers. But good point, we first need to use the organic sources that are available.
And what about the intermediate ones? I'm thinking like microbes that connect to plants and fertilize them more directly, but require less GHGs to make. It's that hybrid.
Yeah. So we're talking, for instance, about beans and peas and those kind of crops.
Cross cropping. Yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
So these crops, they can biologically fix the nitrogen through a symbiosis with bacteria. Yeah. Now the 5 cereals that I mentioned here don't have that capacity, so they depend on fertilizers, on let's say external nitrogen in the soil. But of course, if you increase in your cropping systems, in your cropping plants, also beans and peas, including soybean, then this is positive for the nitrogen requirements. You will need less mineral fertilizers, but not, let's say, not half. You still would need to apply a lot of fertilizers to your cereals to achieve good yields.
Okay, and then so the question. So let's focus on soils. I mean, you're putting out that the current practices are effectively mining soils for nutrients, which is kind of why people deforest. They just keep moving.
Yep.
So under the scheme, would the soil health and nutrition be stabilized? Is there a way to, soils are already degraded. How would you recover their health?
Yeah, so that needs investments in terms of agronomy. So I think, first of all, many soils are rather depleted of soil organic carbon. So you would need to apply organic matter. And not only fertilizers, and you would also need to till the soil in a proper manner, etc., etc. So you're right. Simply adding fertilizers without doing the other things right, including soil management, would not make much sense, because you're wasting your nutrients.
Okay, Sam, what does this mean? So thinking of technologies like biochar, which are kind of allow soil to store more of the fertilizer and
Yeah,
water.
I would say use livestock manure wherever possible, which is quite rich in organic matter. Return crop residues where this is possible and where this is feasible. But I mean, this is easy talk because many of these farms will use their residues to feed to the livestock or to build their houses or their stables, to plaster the walls, etc. So it's easier said than done. But I would say return the available organic matter from livestock, from residues, etc., as much as possible. And there is another kind of issue here, that if yields become higher, if the crops become more productive, you will have more roots, you will have more stubbles, which are added to the soil. So in fact, increasing productivity in that way is also positive for your soil quality.
That makes sense. And now, yeah, looking at water. So yeah, as climate change affects the water cycle, you will have much more presumably irregular, or depending on the region, the local effects. But yeah, how will that ultimately affect things? Because it seems like now that is already a stressor, and in some places it's going to become a huge stressor.
Yeah. No, yeah, right. So I said, look, here are the yield potential with the horizontal lines under climate change conditions. I have to be fair here. This is what we can do. We can estimate the expected climate change until 2050 in terms of, let's say, temperature change and precipitation change. But what we cannot do really well is to deal with extreme events. So extremely hot periods, let's say a week or two of very high temperatures, or extremely long dry periods, let's say El Nino or La Nina years, which are very extreme. These are not well captured in our global circulation model results. And this is also not very well reflected in this diagram. So I think we could say that this is probably a little bit optimistic. So climate change effects will probably be kick in a bit more than I show here.
So actually, how are you modeling this? Because yeah, this is where like the biggest uncertainties and difficulties in modeling are. So what's your approach to estimating this?
So we use dynamic crop growth simulation models. So a bunch of mathematical equations summarizing our knowledge about how crops intercept light and use water, and if they are a bit more sophisticated, also nutrients, and how they respond to stresses in terms of water supply and nutrient supply. So these are dynamic models with a daily time step. So for every day we update the biomass accumulation through photosynthesis. And if the temperatures are becoming more stressful or water becomes more limiting, the photosynthesis will be reduced, and in that way the dry matter accumulation will decrease. So that's the way we basically model the potential yields for every unique situation of climate and soil.
Cool. And so then, I mean, there's like DSAT in that family, right?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, Q3B presented here a bit earlier, and so they were describing some of their work on this.
Right.
So
yeah, very similar type of models, I would say. A little bit less complicated than these subs.
So then, yeah, if you need anything from them, because there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of like, especially under the new conditions, but also under different cropping practices. So what will that community need to deliver for you to make more concise or like targeted predictions or recommendations?
I would not say more complexity in the model so much, but I would argue, first of all, better data from Africa. So doing good experiments, well-managed experiments, to actually test to what extent the models reproduce reality, so to speak, and to parameterize the current models. More complexity to some extent. So better capturing temperature extremes, better capturing rainfall or water availability extremes. Yes, but not always more detail in all the processes because that makes the models very data hungry, and particularly for Africa, the data is not there.
Okay, that makes sense. So now we've been focusing on the supply of just growing the food, but there's a role for markets and the right mixture of different kinds of crops in a market economy, who wants to buy what kind, what's for export, what's for local consumption. So to what extent is that a bottleneck on like agricultural development?
Yeah, so I would, but that's, I mean, it depends a bit. I'm not an economist, so if you would ask an economist, he or she would answer, look, doesn't matter whether a country or a subcontinent is self-sufficient in cereals, as long as it exports other products and it gets finances to import, let's say, the cereals, then it should be okay. So for instance, if they export a lot of cocoa or oil palm or whatever, then they can buy with the money they get from this, they can buy the food. I would argue this is a very vulnerable situation because yeah, the cereals or whatever other main commodities are so fundamental for basic needs of people. And also prices are volatile. I mean, we've witnessed that over the past 5 years with COVID, with the war between Ukraine and Russia, and now with the war in the Middle East. So these factors make prices very volatile and make poor countries very vulnerable for in terms of food self-sufficiency. So yes, export, of course, of other products can make up some of the deficiencies in self-sufficiency. Absolutely, 100% self-sufficiency is not necessary, but for basic commodities, I would argue 80% or so for a subcontinent is very desirable.
Okay. And one thing that at least I personally never have a good intuition for is why are yields so much lower in Africa than in other regions? So I'll give California as an example, which is a water-starved breadbasket, right?
Yeah.
Arguably, California shouldn't have such high yields and amounts, but it does. So what makes, like, is it a technological investment infrastructure? Is it something else that makes, some of these regions like California or even Israel, which is even more water-starved, able to produce where Africa is having difficulties?
Yeah. Now, part of the answer is given in this map, where I show that what farmers achieve in yield for maize in this case is roughly, it's a bit small, but you can see it, I think, 20% of what is theoretically possible without irrigation. So if the farmers did everything perfect, so they applied the fertilizers, they took away the weeds, and they protected the crop against pests and diseases, and they took the right cultivar, etc., they could achieve 3-4 times higher yields. So the soils and the climate, and including the water from rainfall, do allow high yields. So the potential yield is probably 8 tons on average for maize, which is a bit lower than in the United States, but very similar to what you would get in most parts of Europe. So the conditions are, in many places in Africa, allow good yields. The only thing is that conditions are more variable in space and in time. So some locations the soils are really, really poor and depleted, etc. And the precipitation in particular and the onset of the rainy season are variable. So you need to adapt as a farmer to the conditions in a really dynamic way. And this is not always easy to forecast. So it requires very good management and anticipatory skills to how the weather evolves in a particular year. And then the other factor, some of the soils have been depleted, mined and depleted of soil organic carbon. That requires long-term investments to to make the soils fertile again. So this is not something that you will achieve overnight in all of the places.
Right. And then finally, any other factors that would be critical in making this transition possible?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking mostly about agronomy. So what farmers can do, let's say, applying more nutrients, taking the right cultivar, weeding, etc., etc. But of course, if it would, I mean, if it were possible, farmers would probably do it. So there's a whole bunch of factors underlying this that need to change, and that is, in the end, of course, knowledge of farmers. That's one factor. So education, but also, let's say, stability, stable markets, making sure that the farmers can actually sell their products when they harvest for a good price. And that requires, again, good infrastructure, making sure that the fertilizers are there when they need it, for affordable prices. So again, this is infrastructure, this is capacity of suppliers of fertilizers, preferably, I think, in Africa, so not all depending on import from the Middle East or from Europe or from the United States. So building a manufacturing, fertilizer manufacturing capacity in the region as well. So these are the more fundamental factors that need to be changed and to be developed to allow farmers to step up in their management and in their productivity.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Excellent. This is fascinating.
Okay, pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
I wish you the same. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.